This show is part of the Proclaim Podcast Network, thoughtfully crafted, faithfully told stories that proclaim His name. More at proclaim.fm.
Hey y'all, it's me again. Which, of course, it's me, right? You clicked on a Compelled episode. I'm not even sure why I say that it's me, because you obviously know that it's me, but let's put all of that aside, all right? I'm recording an update tonight on Sunday, November 16th, 2025. Tomorrow morning, I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. and fly out to Greenville, South Carolina to interview a very special couple who I've been trying to interview for the last 4 years. In fact, it's a little bit surreal that this moment is finally going to happen. Their story is going to be a surprise, but it is truly out of this world, literally, and I cannot wait to share it with you. And for those who are curious, I normally batch record all of my interviews one time a year because it's more cost effective that way. I'll travel to a city and record 15 to 20 interviews in a single week in a pop-up recording studio that we'll set up in a host church. But it just so happens that I was already going to come to Greenville for a ministry retreat this week, so the timing for this one-off interview was perfect. We've already recorded 18 new testimonies and have already begun editing several of those. In fact, here's a sneak peek of just a few of those. Will struggled with his sexuality while growing up, but finally he made a decision to live as a transgender woman named Maggie and never look back, which he did successfully for 30 years, deceiving everyone he knew. But then one day he encountered the true God of the Bible, who asked him, "Who does God say Will is?" Brittany was young and successful, and her party friends nicknamed her Blackout Brittany. Then one fateful night, under the influence, she drove head-on into the wrong lane of traffic and caused a tragedy that she could never have imagined. Could God really forgive her, much less want her? Ben was the new pastor of a small church in Mississippi. He and his congregation mutually loved and cared for each other until he decided to marry a woman from another ethnicity, and his peaceful flock rebelled. What was God asking him to do? Kayla was sexually abused by a family member for almost a decade. At times, she felt worthless and powerless, incapable of changing her past, present, or future. But then one day, she was introduced to the creator of time and space. Could he redeem what had been broken and restore what had been lost? Marvin was a card-carrying American communist and atheist who couldn't wait to usher in a new era of equality and even tried to become an informant for the KGB. But then one afternoon, he sat frozen in his chair while his brain raced unbidden. What if Vladimir Lenin was wrong about God? John was a Bhutanese convert who was persecuted for becoming a Christian. He fled the country to seek relief, but ended up imprisoned in a foreign nation because he chose to share about Jesus publicly. Could his fledgling faith remain firm? And that's just 6 of the 18 interviews that we've already recorded. But we need your help to carry those across the finish line. As I'm sure you already know, about 5 weeks ago, we launched our fundraising campaign for 2026, and we're off to a great start. We have 2 goals that we want to reach before December 31st. Our first goal is to raise $80,000 to fund our work for next year. That pays for our editors, travel, audio equipment, music licensing, website hosting, podcast hosting. The list goes on and on. And actually, a huge chunk of our budget this year was paying the broadcast fees for our new nationwide radio broadcast. As of tonight, we've raised just over $10,500, which is 13% of our $80,000 goal. And we're just so grateful for that. To each listener who's contributed, let me extend my gratitude. Whether you've given $10 or $1,000, thank you for playing a part in bringing these testimonies to life. We truly would not be able to create Compelled without our listeners like you. So thank you. Our second goal is to have 300 monthly partners. And as of tonight, we have 173, which is 58% of the way there. So again, if you're one of those 173 monthly partners, thank you. Your consistent giving allows us to make long-term plans for the future while simultaneously puts food on the tables of everyone who works on Compelled. So on behalf of the entire team who works on Compelled, thank you. Compelled would not be possible without you. I want to leave you with this last email that we received from a listener. And actually, I just spoke with him on the phone a few nights ago. He writes, I was an atheist homosexual who came to Christ again. And I just needed to listen to something that was going to saturate me with the love of God. I strongly believe in the power of testimony. And after some searching through some podcasts on the podcast app, I listened to yours, and I just never stopped listening. It's amazing to hear people's encounters with Jesus, especially when they come from a place so broken. It's just so encouraging and beautiful. And, we're grateful to receive messages like those. We've got 45 days before the end of the year. And if you've been blessed listening to Compelled the same way that this listener was, would you please prayerfully consider joining us in our work? Like I said, Compelled would not exist without listeners like you. To become a monthly partner or to make a one-time gift, just visit compelledpodcast.com/donate. Again, that's compelledpodcast.com/donate. And now, on to the show.
When I was 15, my parents took me to court, severed their parental rights, made me a ward of the state, and had me put in a state-run institution for juvenile delinquents.
Hi, I'm Donna Schillinger from Rogers, Arkansas. I have about a 30-minute drive to town, which is just enough time to catch an episode of Compelled on the round trip. I love turning what might otherwise be wasted time into productive time, inspirational time, educational time, and even worship time. Compelled stories stay with me through the day and even days to come and challenge me to grow in faith. I hope you enjoy this episode.
I'm Paul Hastings, and you're listening to Compelled, where we use gripping, immersive storytelling to bring to life Christian testimonies from the kingdom of God, told by the people compelled to live for Him. Recently, we heard from Ken Freeman, who as a young boy was beaten, molested, and tortured for years. Anyone ever claiming to love him simply wanted to abuse him. But then one day, Ken was introduced to the love of a perfect father, and his life would never be the same. You can hear the entire story by tuning into episode number 40 with Ken Freeman. Today, our guest is Catherine Zoller, a children's author who writes beautifully illustrated renditions of Bible stories that are set to rhyme. But before Catherine became an author or a Christian, she was a child delinquent, completely out of control and constantly in trouble with her family and the law. But when she escaped state custody and started hitchhiking across the nation, she was picked up by a country pastor who would share a message with her that would transform her life. So gather around, lean in, and join us for another compelling story from the kingdom of God. I met Catherine several years ago while I was walking through the vendor hall at a homeschool conference in Dallas. She was at a booth selling Bible storybooks for children that she'd written, and the books had beautiful illustrations and cover art, so of course I had to stop and chat. And as we spoke, our conversation naturally shifted over to her testimony. And as she shared what God had done in her life, it just blew me away. So a month later, at another homeschool conference, we sat down again, but this time with a microphone. Catherine's story begins in Oklahoma City, where she grew up during the 70s, surrounded by church culture, but never fully grasping what it all meant.
Yeah, we went to church. We went to this, in fact, it was the church my grandfather started. And so we went every single Sunday. My dad didn't go, but my mother would take my brothers and me, and we went to vacation Bible school so I always believed in God, but I never heard the gospel. I heard all the Bible stories, but I never heard that Jesus Christ died on the cross to pay for my sins and rose again and went to heaven to reconcile me with God if I repent. Never heard that.
As Catherine grew up in a household that was moral but not exactly Christian, she realized that she didn't quite fit in anywhere, at school or at home.
I was wildly curious, and I tested the limits. I was the kid that if you drew a line in the sand and said, don't cross that line, invariably I'd go up there and put my toe over it. Just always testing the limits. And my mother was pretty low energy, and both of my parents, if you know anything about temperaments, they were both melancholies, very unusual, and they were both firstborn. My dad an only, my mother an oldest, so a really unusual combination for them to get together. And so the standard in our house, to me as a child, just seemed impossibly high. I couldn't be perfect at everything. I couldn't be perfect at anything. My brother was really smart. He was making the straight A's and could fit into the family system. My younger brother then had some learning disabilities, so he had other issues going on. So I don't think he was expected to keep quite the same standard. And I thought I was stupid. I thought I was dumb because the smart kids made straight A's, and I was not anywhere close to making straight A's. I mean, I fidgeted nonstop. It was impossible for me to sit still for very long periods of time, which is why school was such a nightmare. I just couldn't do it. I mean, I wouldn't even try after a while because it just felt impossible to me. I'm real social, as you can see. So I had tons of friends. We lived in a neighborhood that interestingly enough, there were lots of Catholic families, and they all had, large families. And so there was always somebody to play with. There was always, kickball or baseball or softball or, just all kinds of neighborhood activities. And this was back when, the kids left the house in the daytime and didn't come back until the street lights went on, or my mom rang the dinner bell and we knew it was time to go home. So in that regard, I had a pretty normal childhood. Could ride my bike for miles and miles and be gone all day and nobody worried.
Yeah.
It was more the home structure where, I just felt disapproved of and criticized. And, I knew I was irritating my mother. And I wasn't trying to, but I didn't know how not to.
That's hard.
Yeah.
It's got to be really hard as a kid.
Then, my mother would make me go stand in the corner with my nose in the corner until my dad got home. And then it was my dad's job to discipline me. And he didn't know, the only way he knew to discipline was to spank. And he was spanking me all the way up at 15 because, he just didn't have his own tools for how to discipline and cope. So, he was doing the best that he could, but it was all wrong. Nothing was working. And then he finally told my mom, I'm not going to come home every day and be the bad guy. You need to figure out, how you're going to handle her. So I'm sure that created a lot of tension between them. And it was just kind of a broken mess.
Now, despite her family's dysfunction, there were still seeds that God planted in Catherine's life, some that she wouldn't even realize were there until many years later.
I do know that I had my maternal grandmother adored me. Both my grandmothers adored me, but she just really had a heart for me. And when I think about the agape love of God, I think of her and that she just loved me unconditionally. It didn't matter to her that I was, buzz bombing all over the place. And she was a school teacher. So every summer she'd have me come to her house every day and she would go through workbooks with me and try to get me caught up in math and spelling and all that kind of stuff. And she would always have let me pick out a toy at the beginning of the summer, and she would set it on the chair across from me. And that was my motivation to get through all these workbooks. And I remember one year I wanted the Chatty Cathy doll, and I didn't manage to get through all my notebooks. I don't remember. It's funny that I remember this one. Well, I'll tell you why I remember it, because she gave it to me anyway. I just thought, I wanted this thing so badly. I'd been wanting it forever, and there it was sitting across from me, and I couldn't lay my hands on it because I hadn't finished all these workbooks. And I was just distraught. And of course, in her kindness, she was going to give it to me anyway, and she did. And I just think that's the love of God. He doesn't withhold good things and blessings from his children. So she's that one example of somebody who really exhibited the love of the Lord.
But while Catherine was grateful for the kindness of her grandmother each summer, it still didn't diminish the difficulty she felt throughout the rest of the year.
Life was hard. I mean, not that we didn't have times of enjoyment, but it was hard because my parents didn't understand me and they didn't know how to deal with me. They were not Christians, so they didn't know to seek the Lord. And again, my dad being in the medical field, when I was 9 years old, they told me that I was going to go someplace special. They built it all up. Or, where my brother's going to go? No, neither one of them. So I can hardly sleep. I'm just so full of anticipation. It's like, what are they going to do with just me? I mean, I was all excited. And so then to find out I'm going to a psychiatrist, it was just crushing. Even at 9, I knew that psychiatrists were for crazy people. And so I immediately began to believe 2 lies. The first lie was that there must be something wrong with me. And the second lie was, because there's something wrong with me, it's not okay to be me. And those lies stayed with me for longer than I would like to care to admit.
Now, as Catherine mentioned, the psychiatry visit was intended to help Catherine's parents understand how they could work with their daughter. But really, it ended up planting a dark seed of doubt in Catherine's mind that would fester for years to come. She was plagued with feelings of self-doubt, worthlessness, and helplessness. Just a couple of years later, these feelings were compounded with anger when some major changes shook Catherine's young world as an 11-year-old.
My mother had a massive stroke. 2 weeks later, my grandmother died, and the one that was so dear to me. I was so angry with God. It's like, how could you do this? But I remember laying there on my bed, at 11 years old and shooting my arm out to my side and going, did you know I was going to do that, God? Did you know I was going to do that? Because the idea that, that he was going to take my precious grandmother and not my mother, who I had no relationship with. So, I spent all my time being angry. And this ball of anger, just this blind fury began to take root in me. And God was no exception. I was very angry with him. And so when I got to be a teenager, I started acting out. And I had a boyfriend, and he discovered drugs and introduced them to me. We started with marijuana, but it was truly a gateway drug. And I just did anything and everything that came down the pike. And I realized much later that I was self-medicating. I liked the downers, not the speed, not the cocaine. I liked the stuff that calmed my brain down. Because I was high all the time, I was cutting school. And so I was truant. I didn't like school anyway, and I certainly didn't like to sit there stoned. And there was a pool hall down where they didn't, it was for kids. They didn't serve alcohol. They served pop and snacks. And so I shot pool all day and smoked cigarettes and got high and then would pretend like I'd been in school and get back on the bus and go home and rinse and repeat. Did that every day in 9th grade, which is why, my grades were so abysmal. When I graduated, when I left 9th grade, I had 5 Fs and a D. I have no idea how I got the D, Paul. I was never in class.
Did your parents know that you were doing drugs or that you were skipping school?
Yes, there was one time in particular where I was doing Quaaludes and I'd probably overdone it. And, my dad's a dentist. He works with that stuff. And so he was he pretty much explained that to me. It's like, I know you're on something. And of course, I just denied, never did come clean. And I'm sure, they went through my room and found my marijuana stash and all that kind of stuff. And then my parents would try to discipline me, and I would run away from home. And so this was just causing all kinds of chaos in our family. And so they eventually, when I was 15, I just turned 15, took me to court, severed their parental rights, made me a ward of the state, and had me put in a state-run institution for juvenile delinquents called, ironically enough, the Sunbeam Home.
Wow.
I can assure you that nary a sunbeam came near that place. It was a very dreary, state-run institution.
Now, I don't want to rush over this point. The Sunbeam Home was a state-run facility and only accepted juveniles who were wards of the state. And that's the reason that Catherine's parents felt that they needed to sever their parental rights. Some children in state custody are forced into that situation simply because they don't have a living relative able to be their guardian or to care for them. They are truly orphans. But in Catherine's situation, her parents were still alive, but had voluntarily given her up to the state of Oklahoma. So keep this in mind, because it'll come back to play later in Catherine's story.
It was all an attempt to help me. But again, I'm 15. I don't know anybody else whose parents divorced him and gave him away. I have no self-esteem, and I already feel like I'm stupid and that there's something wrong with me. And now even my own parents are giving up on me and more or less just going, here, you do something with her.
Yeah.
I'm sure to them, they were at the end of their rope and doing everything they possibly could to try to help me. What happens, of course, is you don't rehabilitate yourself and your peers don't rehabilitate you. I just got to be a better juvenile delinquent. And so these kids like to steal cars, so we would skip school and steal cars. And eventually we stole one that had government license plates. There was 4 of us, and we dropped one of them off at the high school where her boyfriend was. The 3 of us went back to the Sunbeam home. She never showed back up. And so we knew the gig was up. Turns out the government doesn't like you taking their things, which is kind of ironic these days. Sure enough, the next day, the FBI shows up at the Sunbeam home, asks for a written statement, handcuffs us, leg cuffs us.
And how old were you?
I was 15. Takes us back to the jail in the little town adjacent to Oklahoma City where we'd stolen these cars. And when we were in the jail cell, I lit a little fire, and they weren't too happy about that, so they slapped an arson charge on me. And I sat there for about a week before my mother came and paid the bail, reluctantly, I might add. So then I went back to the Sunbeam home. This is right before Christmas break. And the way the Sunbeam home was structured was if your parents wanted you on the weekends or holidays or things like that, they could come and get you. They always went snow skiing for Christmas. And so we were getting ready to go snow skiing in about 3 days. But I did what I did best back then, and I screwed it all up. I decided that I was going to go to Florida and pick fruit with the migrant workers because that's what white upper middle class girls do, right?
And just like that, Catherine walked to her school one morning with her fellow Sunbeam housemates, but took a detour before she reached the school doors and ended up at the highway with just the clothes on her back, some drugs, and a couple of dollars. But what Catherine thought was going to be a journey to Florida would actually turn into a divinely appointed encounter, which you'll hear about right after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. We've been listening to Catherine Zoller share about her early childhood and teenage years. She was a child delinquent completely out of control. And at a loss as to what to do, her parents surrendered their parental rights and offered Catherine as a ward of the state. Then, when Catherine was 15 years old, she decided to run away from state custody and hitchhike her way from Oklahoma to Florida, which is where our story picks up again.
I got as far as Monroe, Louisiana, and I got picked up by this little country preacher who asked me if I was a Christian. And I said, yes, I'm an American, because truly that's all it meant to me. And he asked me again, and I said, well, my mom goes to church, and I used to too, blah, blah, blah. And so he asked me if I was hungry. I said I was. He took me to the Dairy Queen and bought me a Dairy Queen hamburger. And while I was sitting there in the bench seat of that brown Maverick, I can still picture it perfectly, he opened up his Bible and started sharing the scriptures with me. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. There's none righteous, no, not one. John 3:16, of course. And something in my spirit began to stir. I'm hearing the truth. And so he takes me back up to the highway, drops me off. I stuck my thumb out, prayed my very first prayer where I wasn't just furious with God. And I said, God, if you're like that man says you are, I hope I get caught tonight. People ask me all the time if I ever saw him again. No, I never saw him again. People have said maybe he was an angel. I don't know. I have no idea. All I know is he was the catalyst that God used to lead me to him. Well, I was wandering around downtown Monroe, Louisiana. I have no idea what happened. There must not be much going on back then because I was surrounded by 6 police cars. It was crazy. To this day, I have no idea who they thought I was or what they thought I was doing. But they arrested me for drug possession and vagrancy and put me in a juvenile detention center there. And I was extremely belligerent. I hope you find that hard to believe. And I wouldn't cooperate in any way, wouldn't tell them my name, nothing. And so they wouldn't let me out of my cell.
Because they had no idea if you were from Louisiana,
right.
from Alaska.
I wouldn't tell them. And of course, I didn't have any ID on me. I was 15, so I didn't have a license or anything like that.
But you had drugs, though.
Yeah, I had drugs. I could get drugs easily. Those truck drivers had lots of really good drugs. At any rate, I was in solitary confinement. I was locked in my cell 23 hours a day. The only time I got out was when in the mornings when I was supposed to mop all the rooms in the hallway. The way it was structured, the bed was like built into the wall. It just came out like this, like a concrete ledge, and it had a little thin mattress on it. There was a sink and a toilet bolted to the floor. That was the only thing in all of these rooms except mine. It had this little salmon-colored metal table with a Bible on it. The reason I tell the part about me being in every single room is I know for a fact that there was one room with one table and one Bible, and I was in it 23 hours a day. When you read a book, you start at the beginning, and it's Genesis. It doesn't make much sense to me at all. I don't even know how far I read in it. I mean, I was 15. That's been a long time ago.
Yeah.
I just know that I was kind of trying to see, figure out how to search through the Bible to find these scriptures or the verses that this guy had me read, because that's what he would do. He'd like turn the Bible to me while I'm eating my hamburger and point to it and say, read that verse. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. So I'm looking to see if I can find these scriptures again, but I didn't know anything about the Bible. It was just gobbledygook, and I couldn't find these scriptures. So I was just sort of randomly flipping around. But I'm telling you, Paul, the Bible is the living, breathing Word of God. It wouldn't have mattered if I'd been reading in Leviticus. The Spirit can penetrate.
Yeah.
And I got down on that cold tile floor and I cried out to God. I asked Him to take this mess of a life that I had made in just 15 short years and to do something, to turn it around. And He showed up. He showed up, and I got radically, unbelievably born again.
Now, think about that. Catherine had run away from state custody, hitchhiked across a good portion of America while being spared a terrible tragedy on the open road, been picked up by a completely random stranger who shared the gospel with her for the first time, was arrested, and then placed in the only cell in the detention center with a Bible, all in the course of just a few days. And as Catherine read the words of God, its description of sin and of God's love for her, it broke her heart and left her transformed into a new creation.
The Lord spoke to me for the very first time ever, and He said, tell them your name. So I told them my name. They got in touch with my parents. My dad arranged for me to fly back to Oklahoma City, and I got there the night before I was due in court. I arrived in court that morning. The judge, I had 6 counts of grand theft auto. I had the arson charge, truancy charges, drug charges. I mean, I just had a laundry list of things. And he gave me an 8-year prison sentence pending a 6-month probation. So that meant I had 6 months to be good, which I knew I couldn't do. Couldn't backtalk a house parent, cut a class, get high, nothing for 6 months. And I just knew it was hopeless. And I'm not even a baby Christian. I'm like an embryo Christian at this point. So I don't know to cry out to God or anything like that. Because I was 15, I would have gone to Tecumseh, to the girls' reformatory for 3 years, and then when I turned 18, sent to the Women's State Penitentiary in Oklahoma. And so I just knew it was over. But God, in His sovereignty, had other plans. I had an aunt and uncle from Wilmington, Delaware, who flew into Oklahoma City unannounced, showed up at my parents' house, and told them that they wanted to take me to live with them.
And did your parents know they were coming?
No.
And how did they know about this?
Because when they had gone skiing without me, because they don't know where I am. I'm on my way to Florida. My mother had very uncharacteristically written this heart-wrenching letter to my Aunt Betty, just saying, we don't know where Catherine is. Things are a mess, blah, blah, blah. And so they came.
Wow.
And so my mother said, absolutely not. She's where she belongs and she's getting what she deserves, and you can get right back on that plane and go home. But my grandfather was a lawyer, and so my aunt and uncle went to him, and he went to the juvenile judge and said, this is a good idea. She needs to go with him. So because they'd severed their parental rights, they had no legal say-so.
Oh, wow.
Totally the sovereignty of God.
Oh, man.
So, just a good example of Him taking something that looks horrible and using it for, our good and His glory. So I fly to Wilmington, Delaware, and 6 months later, all the charges against me were dropped. And so of course, I'm doing the same stuff. I'm still, hanging out with the drug kids at this new high school, and I'm still having a hard time going to classes. And so I'm starting to recreate the same thing. And my aunt was just getting to be where she was at her wit's end. And there was one point where I remember I'd come home and I was, I was high and I'd put the earphones on. I was laying on the floor listening to the stereo, listening to the Beatles, and she, whipped that thing off and she said, "We need to talk." And it's like, this can't go on, and I was scared. I was terrified because I didn't know how to rehabilitate myself, for one thing, but there was no place left to go. I mean, I didn't want to go back to the Sunbeam home. I couldn't go back to my home. I'm running out of options. So it got real quick. They had these very good friends, and they had a daughter who had similar issues like me, and she had become a Christian. She was born again.
The daughter had.
Yes, and so they wanted me to go, her name's Ellis. She's still one of my dearest friends. So they wanted me to go talk to Ellis, and I didn't want to, but eventually I ran out of excuses. So I go and I meet Ellis, and we talk, and talk, and then she invites me to her church, and so that's when I started going to church.
If you had not met with Ellis, do you think you would have been just falling off the rails again in Delaware?
Probably. I mean, it took several months before I was able to, completely change my lifestyle.
Yeah.
And I think that's important for listeners too, because a lot of times when we get saved, God will deliver us instantly. And there's a lot of times where he doesn't. In fact, in my experience, most of the time he doesn't. It's a gradual deliverance. It's what, sanctification and discipleship is all about, growing in your faith and allowing God to bring the internal changes that translate to external behaviors.
Now, to follow up on Catherine's point, everything didn't turn into a Cinderella fairy tale story for her. While her aunt and uncle were kind enough to remove her from her environment in Oklahoma, there was still a very dark side to her stay in Delaware.
The entire time I lived in their house, my uncle molested me. And it just added to this sense of shame and there must be something wrong with me lie that I had in my head. And I knew for a fact that my aunt had no idea, because I figured if she did, she'd kick me to the curb. I mean, he's this highly successful DuPont executive. And so,
This is your aunt and uncle who came to rescue you.
Right.
But actually, it's horrible.
Well, it wasn't pleasant, I can tell you that. So I lived there for 3 years. And the truth is, my aunt, I always say I had two salvations, when I got saved and when my aunt rescued me. So despite what's going on with my uncle, she really was my saving grace.
Did you ever share with your aunt what was going on?
Well, what happened was everything came out. It turns out that he had been unfaithful their entire marriage, multiple affairs, carrying on sometimes 2 and 3 at a time, if you can imagine. And so when all of that came to light, she was getting ready to leave him, divorce him. And I was with my best friend. I was getting ready. I was the matron of honor at her wedding. And I was sitting up in the bathroom. Betty was sitting there talking to me. And she said, "I need to ask you something." I said, "What?" She said, "Was Ned ever inappropriate with you?" And of course, I just started, I'm trying to get ready for this wedding and put my makeup on. And here I am crying it all off. And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Why didn't you tell me?" And I said, I couldn't. You would have gotten rid of me. Of course, she swore that she wouldn't have. But again, he's this very successful vice president for DuPont, extraordinarily successful. So in my mind, who's she going to keep? The wealthy husband or the juvenile delinquent?
Did your Aunt Betty, did she know the Lord at the time?
Yes. And as a result of me coming to live with them, the whole family ended up becoming born again. My uncle eventually, the oldest daughter, well, they have 3 children, and one of them was married and gone, and the other 2 were in college and sort of in and out, but mostly out. So eventually, like I said, the whole family became a Christian simply because I was living there.
Wow.
Well, she used to have to take me to church because I couldn't drive. And so she, would come in and sit in church with me. And so she was the first one to...
Really?
Yeah. Again, just these beautiful parts to the story of how God redeems everything. He redeems our immortal souls. He redeems the things that are done to us. He redeems the things that we do to ourselves. And one day he's going to redeem the entire universe.
While Catherine already had some sense of how God was redeeming her story so far, she had no idea about the next redemptive chapter that he had in mind. Catherine eventually graduated from high school in Delaware and moved out of the house to attend a discipleship school hosted by Youth with a Mission, also known as YWAM. She participated in several short-term mission trips and felt that she was called to work as a missionary behind the Iron Curtain. But when she was rejected from missionary school a couple years later, she took it pretty hard. She became complacent in her faith, and her zeal for the Lord began to take a back seat.
My dad finally called and said, if you're ever going to go to college, now's the hour, you're running out of time. Well, I had absolutely zero business being in school, but, I just didn't know what else to do. So I went back to Oklahoma so he could pay in-state tuition, enrolled in Oklahoma State University. I still had in my mind that I was going to go back to Youth with a Mission, so I thought I'd get a degree in international relations. Turns out that's just politics. So I dropped that pretty quick, and then I decided I'd study French, and then I realized that was a foreign language, so I dropped that pretty quick. And I just kept, changing my major because I had no idea really what I wanted to do. And in retrospect, I know now that I was really clinically depressed at this time. But of course, I hadn't been diagnosed, hadn't even heard the term. So I spent my freshman year, re-enrolled for my sophomore year. I decided I needed some extra spending money, and so I was going to be a desk clerk at the dorm where I lived. And so I had to go a week before classes to be trained. And I met this guy named David Jones, who was also doing the same thing. And he was telling me about his best friend, Jay, who just had rhinoplasty, and his, eyes were all bloodshot and he bruised up, and he looked like he'd been hit by a train. So I'm not thinking anything about it. The next week when classes started, the dorm always had a big burger bash so you could kind of, see everybody you were going to be living with that year. And I'm looking for David, but he's the social chairman, so he's buzzing all around. And I didn't know anybody. And I see this poor, pitiful guy sitting on the grass and eating a hamburger with his face all beat up. And I'm like, that must be the friend. So, I'll talk to anybody. So my dad used to joke that I was the only person he knew who could go into a public restroom and come out with a friend. So I went and sat down and just started chatting with him. And the next day he came up to the desk to ask me out on a date. He was so nervous. He was so, he was like shaking. I thought, if I tell this poor boy no, it's going to take him 6 months to work up enough nerve to ask another girl out.
Yeah.
So to this day, I tell him it was my pity date. So we went out, we started dating, and then I got pregnant. And when I got pregnant, I felt like I'd blown the call of God on my life. I wasn't going to be a missionary. I wasn't going to marry a missionary. I wasn't going to have little missionary babies. And I was devastated. Obviously, we wouldn't have been sleeping together if we, were actually following the Lord as we should have been and as we intended to. We got married and lived in married student housing when our son Jordan was born.
Their son Jordan entered the world on a wintry day in November 1982. He seemed happy and healthy at first, but then at his 6-week checkup, they received some disturbing news. More on that after the break. Welcome back to Compelled. Catherine Zoller and her husband had just welcomed their son Jordan into the world. And at first, he seemed happy and healthy. But at his 6-week checkup, he received a diagnosis about a very serious condition.
Jordan was diagnosed with a heart murmur after he was born, and the pediatrician kept saying, it should go away. Well, it didn't. And so he said, when Jay has a job in insurance, you need to take him to a cardiologist and have him checked out. So he got a job with Texas Instruments in Sherman, Texas. We immediately made an appointment with a cardiologist in Dallas and took Jordan in, and they said, yes, we can hear it. Come back in a year. It should go away.
And how old was Jordan?
Jordan was 18 months old at this time. So he came back in a year, and he said, I can still hear this. The bad news is it's worse than we thought. The good news is we can take care of it all with open heart surgery.
But just before Jordan underwent that surgery, the doctors discovered some terrible news. One of his heart valves hadn't closed correctly at birth, and there was also a hole in his heart. This in turn had created significant scarring in his 3-year-old lungs, and the prognosis was that Jordan would die as a child or in his teens. This was the beginning of multiple invasive surgeries for Jordan. Several years went by, and Jordan was hospitalized several times and even suffered a heart attack. But finally, shortly after he turned 17, Jordan underwent a heart-lung transplant, which seemed to have a miraculous effect on him.
I was starting to write a book about this whole experience called Living with Lazarus, because that's what it was like. It was like watching somebody come back from the dead. It was amazing. He could play basketball. He could ride a bike. He couldn't even go up and down the stairs in our house without oxygen on and being winded when he got to the top of the stairs. So it's just this dramatic transformation, and we're sure that he's going to live a long life and be married and have kids. The lungs are the most delicate transplanted organ because they're the only internal organ that's affected by external stuff. We breathe. So we breathe outside stuff that gets into our lungs. And so they're delicate. And there's a condition called bronchiolitis obliterans. It sounds ridiculous. They call it BO. And that's the death knell for lung transplant patients. But he ended up being diagnosed with BO about a year, maybe 18 months after the transplant. And we looked all over to find somebody that would do another transplant, and nobody would touch him. He was too high risk. And so he lived 5 years after the transplant. He died October 10th of 2004, just right before his 22nd birthday. It's been 16 years, so I still think about him every single day. And every once in a while, a Tom Petty song will come on and I'll have a few teary moments or something. But I know I'll see him again. And there's a hope that we have as believers that when we lose people we love, that we'll see them again. And I have no doubt that Jordan is going to be the one to usher me into the presence of the Lord when it's my turn. We all spoke at his funeral. And one of the things I said, just spontaneously, I hadn't had anything prepared. I just got up there and, we're all shocked and in grief. And I just said, the first thing I'm going to do when I get to heaven is hug Jesus, dance with Jordan, and find Eve and slap her.
Yeah.
Well, everybody laughed, but I was like, I'm serious. I'm going to find her. So we don't grieve as others grieve. There's hope in our grief. But I will also say too, it was 2 years. People will tell you the first year's the worst, and that's true. But for me, the first 2 years were the worst. It took a long time for that black cloud of real intense grief to finally lift.
Yeah.
Even though I had the hope that I would see him again, I still had to go through the grieving process.
Yeah. I'm sure in many ways also for someone that, when we lose a loved one very suddenly or rapidly, we're not prepared for that.
Right.
So there's a different form of grief when that happens.
Exactly.
But then when you have someone that's had a chronic illness for so long, only to think like, wow, it's been solved, it's been resolved, the miracle, Jesus answered our prayers.
Right.
And that for that to then be taken away, that's a different form of grief, I'm sure, too.
That's absolutely the truth. And that was part of the problem is like, it's kind of like, God, why would you allow the transplant to take place and this transformation and his health to come back only to have him die? But, we can ask that about a lot of things. All I know is we got 5 more years with him, and they were, 5 great years I wouldn't trade for anything. And he had a strong faith. I know people would say, Jordan, do you ever ask why me? And he would say, no, I never ask why me. It's why not me? This is a fallen, broken world. Why would I think that something like this wouldn't affect me? So he had a really mature understanding about some spiritual matters, and he never blamed God. He was never angry. He just, he was a great kid. And it's been hard. My children have suffered the loss of a brother, so they've had to have their grieving process, and, it affects the whole family. We talk about him all the time. And then there was the whole thing that I had to work through after Jordan was diagnosed with all his health issues. I kind of felt like King David after Bathsheba's baby, that baby died. It's like, is this God's judgment? Is God punishing me because, we did this thing? And again, as you grow and mature in your faith and learn more and see more and trust more and God does more, you realize, of course not. God's not punitive like that. He's redemptive and restorative.
Yeah.
Now, does he discipline us? Yes, but he didn't have Jordan die because I got pregnant out of wedlock.
Now, I told you at the beginning of this episode that I first met Catherine at a conference where she was selling books that she'd written for children. Well, the story of how she became a children's author is actually tied into all of the stories that we've heard so far. And now that we have the proper backstory, here's how it all comes together. And it starts with a flashback to 1988 when Jordan was only 6 years old.
One night when we were still living in Sherman, there was this giant full moon hanging right outside the bay window in our apartment bedroom. And I couldn't sleep, pretty chronic condition for me. And so I just held my hands up in the moonlight and I said, God, what do you want to do with these hands? And the Lord spoke 5 words to me. He said, I want you to write. Well, I jumped, me? So I jump out of bed, I run downstairs, I grab a pad and pen, and I'm like, okay, what? But nothing's coming. Nothing's coming. I'm making a grocery list. That's actually in the About the Author thing. Along came the sun with the dew and the mist, but all I had written was half a grocery list. But I knew the Lord had spoken to me. And so it was kind of like Mary, I just treasured that in my heart. I didn't tell a soul. And I'm thinking maybe I'll write my testimony. I'm thinking maybe I'll write this Living with Lazarus book. The years roll by and things begin to happen. So anyway, we're back in Tulsa. My mother-in-law invites me to her Bible study, and I go, and I parked in the wrong spot, and they made me move my car, and I sat in the wrong seat, and they made me move up and in. And if you don't have your lesson done, you can't talk. And I just thought, this is too much like kindergarten. I can't do this.
Yeah.
And so but I couldn't figure out how to tell my sweet mother-in-law that I didn't want to come to her stupid Bible study anymore. So I kept going, and I ended up staying 8 years because it was really a fabulous, it was 9 months of studying a particular book of the Bible. And I hadn't had that kind of really in-depth Bible study since I'd been in YWAM. So it was, I ended up really kind of getting past all the rules and regulations and deciding that this was something I wanted to do. And at the end of every year, they have what they call Share Day, and anybody who wants to can get up and say what they got out of that year's study. Well, we'd been studying the book of Genesis, and I was laying in bed the night before Share Day because I'm a speaker, and I knew if there was a microphone, I was going to be in front of it. The question is, what am I going to be saying?
Yeah.
And these couplets started coming to mind. This is the one true story of how everything began. Because of love, our God began to formulate a plan. I thought, well, that's kind of clever. So I got up and wrote it down and went back to bed. And another one came. For 6 short days he labored as he shouted his commands. Up popped the stars, the trees, the seas, the mountains, and the lands. And then the Lord let loose with his vast imagination, creating all the animals and all the vegetation. I'm like, that's really clever. So I get up and I write it down. And they keep coming to me. So I thought, I just need to stay up until these that stopped coming to my mind. And by the time the sun came up that morning, I'd put the entire book of Genesis to rhyme. I rush off to class. I read it. I'm thinking they're going to think this is a silly little poem for kindergartners or something. And this is a rather stoic group of white women not given to spontaneous bursts of applause. And they went nuts. Oh, they were applauding. It was crazy. So after class, all these women are rushing up to me with dollar bills and slips of paper with their addresses saying, make a copy and send that to me. Make a copy and send that to me. I had one woman say, Catherine, have you ever thought about making that into a children's book? I said, I hadn't thought of any of it till 3 o'clock this morning. But that got the wheels turning. I joined a Christian writers group that meets there in Tulsa. I learned what a query letter was and got out Sally Stewart's writer's guide. And I made 35 copies of this poem and wrote 35 very finely crafted query letters. I kissed them goodbye, prayed over them, and sent them off to these different publishing houses. And then I sat back because I figured there would be a bidding war. You know, I knew that Stephen King had gotten a $400,000 advance for Carrie. So I'm thinking, well, this is much better. This is eternal.
Of course.
What am I going to get?
Of course.
And what I got was 34 very finely crafted rejection letters and a phone call from one man who said, I think there might be something to this. And so that got the journey of getting published started. I say it took me about 3 hours to write that thing and 13 years to get it published. 3 of those years I was looking for an artist. I looked all over the country, coast to coast. I ended up with a publisher in Mobile, Alabama, a little Christian publishing house. And so I got the first 2 books published, Genesis and Matthew. And then I get a call from the publisher, and he said, I had a Spanish publisher that comes to my office every year looking for titles to translate, and the only ones she wants this year are yours. I said, why? And he said, because they're the only ones that translate culturally. I'm like, okay, well, that makes sense. So I'm having this conversation, but they rhyme. You know, I just couldn't figure out how we were going to do that in Spanish and Portuguese and have it. And I finally said, well, I'm just afraid they're going to lose some of their charm. And he's such a man. He goes, well, it's not really about the charm now, is it? It's about getting the word out. I was like, well, shut my mouth. So I said, let's do it. I hung up the phone, and all of a sudden I'm thinking, these books are going to go around the world. And I ran into my living room. I'm jumping up and down. I'm having a hallelujah shout down. I'm getting saved all over again. You know, I was just going nuts and just worshiping the Lord. And Paul, the Lord spoke to me so clearly, and he said, Catherine, you are a missionary. You are a missionary. And he redeemed that call that I thought I had blown 27 years ago. When I had gotten pregnant. And now I've got 10 titles in the series, and I'm working on the 11th right now.
As we concluded our conversation, I mentioned to Catherine that my wife and I had purchased her adaptation of the Book of Esther and read it to our 2-year-old and 4-year-old. Not only did they love it, but my wife and I also found it intellectually stimulating and beautifully illustrated. Simply put, it was a joy to read, and we could feel so much of Catherine's personal journey and passion brought to life through the pages of Esther's story.
If the parents aren't engaged, it's not going to keep the children engaged. And the thing about Esther that makes it such a great story, it's a melodrama. You've got your villain that you can hiss at and your hero that you can clap for and your heroine. And I tell people too, that particular book is all about identity and destiny because Esther was at the bottom rung of society. She was an orphan, she was a Jew, and she was a girl. I mean, and yet what does God do? He takes her destiny that looked like she was going to be a nobody forever and die a nobody and elevates her to, she's like second in command in the kingdom. I mean, she's the queen.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful story. When people have adopted or foster children, I always encourage them to buy that book and read it to the kids and talk to them about their identity and their destiny. Our identity is who God made us to be, and our destiny is what has He created us to do.
Yeah.
Because we each have both.
What would you say to the parents that are listening and they have a child who is off the rails?
I would say pray. I would say seek wise counsel. I'd say take a hard look at yourself. I'd say get the help you need. Don't be afraid to get counseling. Don't be afraid to call your pastor. Don't be afraid to find outside sources to help you. There are resources out there. You just have to pray and ask God to bring them to you, show them to you, and you have to be willing to be humble and let people know there is a situation here with my child and I absolutely don't know what to do about it.
Catherine, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you, Paul. It was a real pleasure and a privilege.
Catherine's story has so many twists and turns, and there are a lot of takeaways, more than we could possibly begin to cover. But one that really stood out to me is the way that God can use an individual moment of obedience to change someone's life. For example, the random country preacher outside Monroe, Louisiana, who picked up Catherine as she was hitchhiking alone on the side of the road. Not only did he take the time to buy Catherine a hamburger and find out more about who she was, but he shared the message of Jesus with her that she had never heard before. And while he may have left that day thinking that he hadn't made a difference, God used that as the genesis to transform Catherine's heart in her detention cell just days later. And I also think about Catherine's friend Ellis in Delaware, who was not just a kind friend, but a faithful witness to Catherine and who brought her to church. And of course, I think about how Catherine's spiritual journey and transformation was a testimony to her aunt, uncle, and cousins who all eventually came to know the Lord. And may that be an encouragement to each of us right now that God can use any of us at any time, even if we feel like it was a lost cause. Now, before we wrap up, here's a short update from Catherine that she just sent to us, bringing us up to speed on her life since she shared her testimony on Compelled.
Hi, Paul. You had asked me to give you a follow-up from our conversation 4 years ago to let you know what I'm doing now. And I'm kind of doing the same thing. I'm going to a lot of homeschool conventions to sell my books. I speak there. I speak on understanding the temperaments and their blends. It's a lot of fun. I love encouraging people. I love giving people information that's going to help their marriage, help their parenting, help them in any way they can. I've only got 10 books in the series. During the interview, I said I was going to put out an 11th, but my husband's about 2 years away from retiring, if that, maybe sooner. And so I'm starting to kind of wind down. Our children want us to move to be near them. So we're talking about splitting our time between Athens, Georgia, and South Dakota. There's just a lot of changes afoot, for sure. But still, the books are my main priority. And when I developed them, I kind of used this faith principle, if you want to take that acronym. So the way I explain it is the F is they're fun. When I was talking to the illustrator, I told him, I said, be sure and put some humor in these books, because if the parents don't enjoy reading them, then they're not going to read them to their children. I really visualize them as read aloud books. And so he's done that. He's done some really funny illustrations. The A is for all ages. People ask me all the time, what age group do these appeal to? And the truth is, I did a 5-question survey of all the Christian schools in Tulsa to answer that question. And it was amazing. They all came back exactly the same, pre-K to 12. But everybody loves rhyme and Everybody loves David's illustrations. And I get emails from people of all ages. I got an email from a mother a while back, and she just said, I can't believe my hyperactive 2-year-old son will sit and listen to this entire book being read. The I is for illustrations. Again, David's illustrations are just brilliant. They're hilarious. They're very well researched. He puts a lot of research into each one of the books. One of my favorite is in Leviticus, where he illustrates the feasts of Israel and shows the Old Testament requirement with the New Testament fulfillment, because Jesus either has or will fulfill all of the feasts. And so that, again, is beautifully illustrated. The T is that they're theologically accurate. It's critically important to me that these books reflect the Bible as accurately as possible. I took it very, very seriously because, God tells us, not to change his word. And I've got a theologian friend and a son who's a pastor, and we go through each book literally line by line by line by line to make sure that they're accurate. The H is for heirloom quality. I wanted people who buy these books for their children. I wanted the children to read them to their children. Should Jesus not come back for a while, I pray that he does. But I wanted them to be lasting and to be durable. If anybody's interested in trying to look at them or purchase them, they can go to the website. The website is therhymeandreasonseries.com. Again, therhymeandreasonseries.com. And if they are interested in having me come speak, they can also contact me through the website. I would be delighted to hear from any of your listeners. And thanks again, Paul, for this wonderful opportunity to follow up with you and your audience on things that have been going on since we did that interview.
My family has enjoyed several of Catherine's books at this point, especially Esther and Exodus. They've been a huge hit, especially with our kids, and yes, with the parents too. I would encourage you to check out our website at Catherine Zoller. That's Catherine spelled with a C, Catherine Zoller, Zoller, CatherineZoller.com. Or you can go to our website, compelledpodcast.com, and look up the show notes for this episode. There will include links to her website, books, and more. Again, you can find all of that at compelledpodcast.com. And if you know someone who would be encouraged by Catherine's testimony, please send this to them. It's episode number 41 with Catherine Zoller. It's our joy to release these stories for free, but that's only possible because of our sponsors and the generous financial support of our listeners like you. Creating stories like these is not cheap. In fact, a single episode takes upwards of 80 hours to produce. So if you'd like to help us continue creating more stories just like Catherine's, then consider joining Compelled as a monthly partner. You'll get access to all of our behind-the-scene interviews with over 100 hours of additional interview content that we never had time to publish. And you'll also get access to all of our new episodes 1 week early without ads. There's no set price. It's totally up to you. Just choose the monthly amount that makes sense for you. And by doing that, you're helping us create new episodes of Compelled. To join as a monthly partner or to make a one-time donation, just visit compelledpodcast.com/donate. Today's story was edited by Zach Fowler and Micah Foster, script assistance from Mark Weber, sound engineering by Sonomorphic, and our associate producer is my outgoing wife, Sarah Hastings. I'm your host, Paul Hastings, and you've been listening to Compelled. We'll be back next time with another compelling story. We'll see you then.